Power is now restored in most major cities across Ukraine, just days after the country witnessed its biggest aerial attack from Russia in weeks. And on the battlefield, the fight for the eastern city of Bakhmut is intensifying, the British Defense Ministry calling it a killing zone. Over the weekend, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces spoke to the current chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff about the need to reinforce its air defense capabilities. Retired Admiral Mike Mullen is a former U.S. Joint Chiefs chairman. He served as the country's top military officer under President Bush and President Obama. I spoke to him about these latest attacks and his expectations for Ukraine's military. Admiral Mullen, very good to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, I wonder if we can start looking at the situation in Ukraine, particularly as Russia launched this new wave of airstrikes at its cities across the country, civilian infrastructure, the energy grid once again hit. We have seen intensity on the front lines in places like Bakhmut, but now that we're seeing it once again in cities, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's all part of the Putin's desire to turn as much of the country into rubble as he possibly can, and to try to intimidate and terrorize as much of the Ukrainian population as possible. And obviously, very sadly, all of these strikes involve the loss of innocent lives, women and children included. And I think we will see this continue over time. It's very clear that Putin's forces on the ground have suffered mightily, and he's shifted certainly over the winter to this strategy of long-range missiles attacks. And I think that'll continue, although I fully expect that there will be a counteroffensive on the part of the Ukrainian forces here in the spring, which Putin's going to have to address as well. And the Russian forces have done very, very poorly, in particular in any kind of ground fighting. Yeah,
and I want to look at that because we've talked about the potential for a spring offensive or counteroffensive, and of course, both the Russians and Ukrainians have taken the winter in order to prepare for that. What do you think it looks like, and when does the most intense period kick off in your mind?
Well, my expectation is when the weather gets a little warmer, that it'll kick off per se. It's hard to say exactly. I think there's little question that it's going to occur, and most of it appears to, if not all of it, appears to be in the east and in the southeast. At least that's the plan. And I'm encouraged by what the Ukrainian forces have done so far. Their ability to learn. They're in fact training in something we call combined arms right now, which is really bringing all aspects of your ground forces and your air forces together simultaneously to have an effect on the ground, to include, the new tanks, the Strykers, the Bradleys, air defense, artillery, mortars, et cetera. All of that will come together. And I think the potential is to have a devastating effect on any kind of ground attack that the Russians bring forward.
I'll add to that list of new kit Leopard tanks, 8 of which Canada provided. And earlier this week, I was in Poland looking at Canadian soldiers who were, in fact, at that moment training Ukrainian forces who'd been pulled from the front lines to familiarize them with that particular weapon system. When you look at the addition of armor, of these armored vehicles as well, I think still Russia outnumbers in terms of the number of vehicles it has. But when you look at what the West has been able to provide, how does that change the dynamic?
Well, I think Russia's outnumbered the Ukrainians from the beginning. That has, at least to this point, proved not to be much value because of how they've executed. They've lost in this current, I know there's been great focus on Bakhmut lately, but they've lost thousands of troops. They've lost an enormous amount of equipment, which is pretty consistent with how they fought. So I would expect that to continue. The Ukrainians, much differently, have been quick to train, quick to learn, quick to adapt, and very quick to defeat the Russians time and time again. So my expectations are that will continue, and there'll be more and more pressure on the Russians in the east to achieve what President Zelenskyy and his military leadership continue to focus on, which is take back all of Ukraine.
President Zelenskyy, of course, had asked for those tanks. He eventually got them, but it took quite some time. He has been asking for fighter jets, and I wonder, in your estimation, if it is an inevitability that the West will provide them. And I say that in the context that there are at least 2 Ukrainian pilots now at a military base in the U.S. testing their skills on F-16 flight simulators.
I think F-16s will be provided. It's hard to know exactly when, but I think they're coming. If I were going to pick one area where they really need to make sure they are as advanced as they can possibly be, it's in air defense and getting all those systems in place to counter some of the kinds of attacks that occurred in the last day or so. But I expect those F-16s will eventually get there and will make a significant difference. I mean, I give the political leadership, the NATO political leadership, the leadership of President Biden in my own country, great credit for getting the systems that Ukrainian needed, when they needed it. There's been this debate about getting things there on time. All in all, I think the NATO forces, the coalition, and the allies of Ukraine have done a tremendous job to get support for Ukraine in a timely enough way for them to make a really, really big difference.
Can you see, given the positions of both Ukraine and Russia, that Ukraine doesn't want to surrender any territory and Russia wants more than it has right now, can you see a way that this conflict ends this year, militarily?
I mean, I'm actually hopeful, just because there's been so much devastation. We've been talking about an end game, literally, as the conflict started. It has turned into a great degree a battle of attrition, and that's why resourcing the Ukrainians as much as possible, I think, is critical. And you hear stories, maybe you've seen yourself, the issue of running out of ammunition or running low on ammunition, even though these very capable missiles were shot over the last couple of days. At least the report is that the Russians don't have very many of them. So I'm actually hopeful that the offensive, the counteroffensive, and the rest of the fight, as tragic as it will be, will put both sides in a position to try to end it this year. I do think that it's important that the EU look, quite frankly, pretty quickly to bring Ukraine in, to give them an underpinning, quite frankly, of an economic future and a rebuilding future, as well as a security guarantee that will come along with this, because I really believe this has to be the last time Putin does this.
Can I ask you, when you speak about ammunition and the things that the West has provided, Russia, of course, has gone shopping itself, reports of it going looking for artillery shells and getting them from the North Koreans. Now, China is said to be considering the transfer of military grade equipment and ammunition. How concerned do you think Western allies should be that will indeed happen?
I think we need to be hugely concerned about that. Certainly, the West has signaled to China what a horrendous mistake that would be. I think we all know that the relationship between the West and China, particularly the U.S. and China, is at an all-time low since 1972. And if the Chinese made a decision to provide lethal weapons to Russia, that would continue that descent. And in fact, emphasize what I call this global security structure now that very much links what's going on in Europe to what's going on in the Western Pacific, particularly with the potential regarding Taiwan. So I think it'd be a very dangerous step for the globe for China to do what many people have talked about them being on the edge of doing and giving lethal weapons to Russia.
A lot for us all to watch out for. Admiral Mullen, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.